I. Today's reading is called The Soldiers Mocked Jesus. Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the governor's headquarters, and they gathered the whole cohort around him. They stripped him, they put a scarlet robe on him, and after twisting some thorns into a crown, they put it on his head. They put a reed in his right hand and knelt before him and mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." They spat on him and took the reed and struck him on the head. After mocking him, they stripped him of the robe and put his own clothes on him. And then they led him away to crucify him. That's Matthew 27, verses 27 through 31. It's a terrible, terrible story. And there are 2 points that I've been thinking about. The first is, it wasn't enough to kill Jesus. They had to strip his dignity. They had to make him so low. And I think this is something that we know is true about us as people, that in order to commit some horrible cruelty towards someone, you have to dehumanize them first. One group feels they don't have agency, and so they take it out on someone else. They feel low themselves, and so it makes them feel better if somebody's lower than they are. And so I can imagine those soldiers were probably pretty low paid. They might have themselves felt very oppressed. It might have felt really good to them to take it out on someone else. And by making Jesus dehumanized in that way, it allowed them then to crucify him. It's like a necessary step. So it strikes me that that's part of why good German citizens felt they could look the other way during the Holocaust. The Jews had been dehumanized. They weren't human. So good Germans didn't have to care about them or try to do something to save them. And isn't that our history in our country with racism as well? We could commit horrible cruelties against slaves, and we can commit horrible cruelties against George Floyd and other victims of racism because we've dehumanized people. So that was the first point. And I've been reflecting on a hymn I've always loved. It's 349 in the Lutheran hymnal, and it's called Ah, Holy Jesus. And the first verse is, "Ah, holy Jesus, how hast thou offended, that we to judge thee have in hate pretended, by foes derided, by thine own rejected, O most afflicted." So that's that story. It's Jesus not only being killed, but being afflicted, being rejected, in hate, being derided by his foes. So the second point that I wanted to make about this is that who did this to Jesus? Well, we know it was the soldiers in this case. And I think we can all look at that story of the soldiers stripping Jesus, putting the scarlet robe on him, mocking him, thorns and a crown, all of those things, stripping him, and think, those evil people, I wouldn't have done that. That wouldn't have been me. I would have treated him more humanely. And yet, would each of us have done anything different? Would I have done anything different? And there's this idea that's one label for it is misguided exceptionalism. And that's this kind of holier than thou. It's, if I were in a situation, if I were one of the Germans, I would have been one of the good guys who would have hidden the Jews and protected them. I would have been the one to stand up and protect George Floyd. I would have been the one to stand up against racism. And yet we find that social science shows that in our own predictions about behavior, we usually think we're going to be the good ones who stand up and do what's right. And yet there are many forces that lead people to kind of go in with the crowd and maybe not live up to the ideals that they have. Um, and we consider ourselves to be free agents and spiritually directed good Christians, and yet we can also be the ones who are dehumanizing others. um, the story about the Jews and the Holocaust is one that we all hear about, and yet um, people who study the Holocaust look at what's going on today, and the racism in our country. What is the issue that we're not standing up for? We have a migrant support ministry, but are we doing enough to stand up against all of the mistreatment of people who are trying to be great to our country? What are we doing about our prison population? We know Vicar Melody is doing something about that, and trying to address mass incarceration. And how are we all standing on these issues that might, in 100 years, people look back and think those are the issues of our time, where we needed to be the ones to step up. So I have one more verse from Holy Jesus, which again I think really encapsulates this idea, um, that it could be any of us committing this crime against Jesus, or this dehumanization. Who was the guilty? Who brought this upon thee? Alas, by treason Jesus hath undone thee. 'Twas I, Lord Jesus, it was denied thee. I crucified thee. So that's the end of this reflection on Matthew 27.